far is the United States willing to go in the name of law and order? That question exploded across Chicago this month after ICE executed what's now being called Operation Midway Blitz, the largest immigration raid in the city's modern history. Federal agents poured into the streets before dawn, armored vans filling suburban neighborhoods from Park Ridge to Cicero. Within just 14 days, more than 500 undocumented migrants had been taken into custody, an operation that DHS described as a model for the nation. But the sheer scale of it raises a deeper question. Is this about justice or about power? The Department of Homeland Security confirmed to Reuters that the multi-agency sweep involved over 450 officers, many of them flown in from other states under emergency federal orders signed by President Trump. The plan was blunt dismantle Chicago's sanctuary network and set a precedent for future nationwide raids. ICE's acting director Marcos Charles called it the most aggressive immigration enforcement initiative in decades. According to the Associated Press, about 60% of arrests were targeted individuals already on ICE's radar, while the rest were collateral, meaning they were picked up on the spot. That last category has proven explosive. Civil rights monitors told The Guardian that collateral arrests banned under the Biden administration are now back in full force, sweeping up workers, vendors, and even U.S. citizens caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. 2 such citizens were reportedly detained before being released after proving their status. Analysts from the Migration Policy Institute noted that this tactic may violate the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable seizures, reviving legal questions the courts had buried years ago. Inside, DHS sources quoted by NBC News said the raids were designed to send a visible message ahead of 2026, when Congress will debate a new border security funding bill. In other words, Chicago became the stage for a national show of strength. Yet it was also a logistical test. Reports from Defense News suggested that federal planners repurposed a small naval facility near Great Lakes to house detainees temporarily, a move that critics said blurred the line between civilian enforcement and military readiness. Local reaction was swift and divided. To Trump's supporters, this was the long-awaited fulfillment of his 2024 campaign promise, no sanctuary for illegals. To Chicago's leadership, it was an assault on their autonomy. Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton denounced the operation as a sick reality show, warning that the raids would tear apart communities that built this city. Her words went viral, fueling protests downtown, where masked ICE agents clashed with demonstrators. Political analysts from Brookings warned that Midway Blitz marks a shift from selective enforcement to mass mobilization, a model where fear replaces policy. If 500 people can be detained in 2 weeks in a single city, what happens when this becomes the national standard? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, what happens when the line between policing and intimidation disappears entirely? By week 2 of Operation Midway, Blitz Chicago's skyline had become the symbol of a new immigration era, one where federal power seemed to outweigh due process. The sheer volume of collateral arrests shocked observers nationwide. Out of more than 500 detainees, official DHS reports revealed that only about 30% had criminal records, while the remaining 70% were swept up incidentally, workers, parents, and students caught in ICE dragnets. This is not precision enforcement, this is mass apprehension, said a senior fellow from the Migration Policy Institute in an interview with BBC News. The reinstatement of collateral arrests was no accident. President Trump's 2025 immigration directive, signed just days after his inauguration, explicitly overturned Biden-era guidelines that limited ICE to targeting individuals with violent criminal convictions. The new rules grant agents broad discretion to detain anyone suspected of immigration violations. Civil liberties attorneys described it to The Guardian as arrest, first verify later. In practice, that meant entire families awoke to pounding on their doors before dawn, their neighborhoods filled with tactical vehicles and federal officers wearing masks. Footage obtained by Reuters showed several residents detained outside grocery stores, while others were taken at bus stops. For many, these scenes evoked memories of past raids from the early 2000s, but with one major difference: the level of force and coordination. Over 400 ICE agents backed by DHS field support and even surveillance drones from Customs and Border Protection executed synchronized operations across Cook County. To justify the scale, Trump's DHS pointed to record numbers of illegal border crossings this summer, arguing that interior enforcement was the only way to restore order. Yet many analysts questioned the logic. According to Al Jazeera, the majority of Chicago's undocumented population has lived in the U.S. for over a decade, contributing billions in taxes and labor. Removing them, economists warned, would devastate key industries such as construction and hospitality sectors already struggling under inflation and worker shortages. Legal experts highlighted another danger, the growing normalization of federal intrusion into local policing. Under long-standing precedent, immigration enforcement is a federal function, but the intensity of ICE's collaboration with certain police departments in Illinois blurred the boundaries. This creates a dual system of fear, explained Laura Mukherjee, a civil rights lawyer cited by the New York Times. Local police lose community trust, and federal agencies act with near impunity. The erosion of trust became visible fast. Hotline reports to immigrant aid groups surged 180% in less than 10 days. Schools saw attendance drop sharply in Latino neighborhoods. Churches began organizing sanctuary shelters for those afraid to leave their homes. And yet, Trump's administration celebrated the raids as proof of restored authority, branding Chicago a law enforcement success story. But behind that narrative lay a darker truth. Unchecked enforcement tends to create more chaos than order. As one DHS insider anonymously told NBC, "We're not just deporting criminals, we're deporting stability." The question now loomed larger than Chicago itself. If the government can detain hundreds of non-criminals without local oversight, what does that mean for the rule of law in America's future? The tension exploded into tragedy on September 12th in Franklin Park. A quiet suburb suddenly turned crime scene. What began as a routine traffic stop ended with the death of 38-year-old Silverio Villegas Gonzalez, a father of two. According to official DHS statements, Gonzalez allegedly attempted to flee and dragged an agent with his car. The officer responded with gunfire. Gonzalez was killed instantly, his two young sons left without a father. Yet eyewitness accounts and security footage told a murkier story. Civil rights groups said Gonzalez was unarmed, had no criminal history, and was shot while trapped in his seatbelt. The Department of Homeland Security called the shooting justified use of force, but outrage spread fast. The Guardian reported that this was the third fatal ICE encounter in 2025, following similar incidents in Texas and Arizona. The Franklin Park case crystallized fears that Trump's no-leniency policy had transformed enforcement into open confrontation. The use of militarized tactics, armored vehicles, automatic rifles, masked agents was now common even in suburban neighborhoods. Experts in police ethics drew troubling parallels. Professor Michael German, a former FBI agent now at the Brennan Center, told BBC News that ICE operations increasingly mirror counterinsurgency tactics where civilian environments are treated as hostile zones. The distinction between battlefield and community is disappearing, he warned. This blurring is especially dangerous when agents operate under limited oversight. ICE's Internal Affairs Unit reports directly to DHS, meaning investigations of shootings rarely reach outside prosecutors. In Gonzalez's case, Illinois authorities demanded transparency, but DHS refused to release the officer's name, citing security concerns. That secrecy only fueled anger. Protests erupted downtown with thousands chanting "No more midnight raids" outside federal buildings. Local clergy, immigrant groups, and civil rights lawyers demanded an independent investigation, arguing that the agency had crossed a constitutional line. Numbers underscore the trend. According to data from Reuters, use of force incidents involving ICE increased by 74% in the first half of 2025 compared to the previous year. The majority occurred during arrests of individuals with no violent criminal record. Critics say this escalation correlates directly with the president's 2025 executive order removing restrictions on physical force during potential flight risks. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem defended her agents, insisting the department faced unprecedented hostility from radical protesters. But to many, that defense rang hollow. Chicago's Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton countered on NBC. "This is not law enforcement, it's intimidation." The Franklin Park tragedy rippled beyond Illinois. Civil rights organizations filed petitions with Congress demanding hearings on federal accountability. The American Civil Liberties Union warned that the pattern of killings could expose the administration to international scrutiny under human rights law. Even the Washington Post editorial board called for urgent reforms in the oversight of ICE field operations. Yet Trump remained defiant. Speaking at a rally in Florida, he praised ICE officers as heroes, cleaning up America, doubling down on plans to replicate Midway Blitz across 12 additional cities by year's end. That statement ignited new fears of systemic violence under the banner of security. And so the question deepened in the pursuit of control. How much collateral damage can a democracy absorb before it loses its moral compass? By mid-September, Chicago was no longer just the backdrop of an immigration raid. It had become a city on edge, a case study in what happens when federal and local governments collide head-on. Streets once filled with morning commuters now echoed with chants and sirens. Protesters clashed with armored ICE squads in the Loop, waving signs that read, "Families not fear." Meanwhile, the Trump administration held firm branding the demonstrations as lawless resistance. Governor J.B. Pritzker and Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton accused the White House of running a show of force, not a policy. Stratton's words calling the operation a sick reality show gained national traction. According to Reuters, nearly 250,000 residents in Cook County either stayed home from work or altered their routines in the week following the raids. Restaurant sales dropped, public transport ridership dipped, and schools reported attendance plunges of up to 40% in immigrant neighborhoods. The psychological toll was staggering. The Guardian interviewed local families who refused to send their children to school, fearing traffic stops or random ID checks. Small business owners told DW they saw entire streets empty out by dusk. The fear spreads faster than the raids, a sociologist from Northwestern University observed. It's economic and emotional warfare rolled into one. At the heart of the chaos stood Chicago's Mayor Brandon Johnson. With approval ratings already below 10%, his condemnation of federal tactics only inflamed the conflict. "Law enforcement is a sickness," he declared, a line that reverberated from Fox News to Al Jazeera. Trump's team seized on it immediately, framing Johnson as soft on crime and hostile to American law enforcement. "Chicago is a disaster," the president thundered at a rally in Ohio. "We're saving it from weak leadership." Within hours, ICE escalated again. Agents publicly paraded the arrest of Aldo Salazar Bahena, a convicted murderer just released from state prison, a move clearly meant to paint critics as defenders of criminals. The Department of Homeland Security pushed footage of the arrest across social media, declaring this is who sanctuary policies protect. Political strategists from The Atlantic noted the timing just as protests reached their peak. The administration reframed the narrative from oppression to protection. But the city's response only hardened. Demonstrators filled Daley Plaza on Mexican Independence Day, chanting against Trump's war on immigrants. Organizers urged undocumented residents to stay indoors, fearing ICE might use the festivities as a lure. Stratton warned the same night that any confrontation could justify federalized troops in Chicago. Her fear wasn't unfounded. Trump's advisors reportedly drafted contingency plans to deploy National Guard units under the guise of civil order support. At the same time, the FBI and DHS began monitoring protest groups for domestic subversion. Civil rights lawyers told BBC News that Chicago risked becoming a testbed for militarized policing on American soil. The combination of surveillance raids and mass detentions blurred the boundary between immigration control and martial law. Yet amid the turmoil, many residents, even those critical of illegal immigration, expressed fatigue and unease. "We wanted safety, not soldiers," one Chicagoan told NBC. That sentiment captured a growing divide in the American public between those craving order at any cost and those fearing that freedom itself was being redefined. As September waned, the city had become the front line of a much larger national experiment, one that raised a haunting question. If this is what restoring order looks like, what will America look like once it spreads? As Chicago reeled from weeks of unrest, another conflict emerged, one not fought in the streets but in Congress and the courts. The issue: masks. ICE agents had been operating with covered faces throughout Operation Midway Blitz, claiming it was to protect their identities from retaliation. But civil rights groups, lawmakers, and even some police unions called it what it was: a symbol of unaccountable power. The controversy exploded when California Governor Gavin Newsom signed the No Secret Police Act, banning face coverings for all state and federal law enforcement operating within his state. The bill quickly gained traction nationwide, with 12 Democratic representatives from Illinois co-sponsoring similar legislation. Its language was sharp. Any agent conducting arrests on U.S. soil must be visibly identifiable by name and agency. Supporters argued it was a safeguard against abuse, recalling cases where victims couldn't even identify who detained them. Homeland Security hit back hard. In a statement to Reuters, officials warned that assaults on ICE officers had increased by over 1,000% since early 2024, making anonymity a matter of survival. "These men and women are protecting America's sovereignty," Secretary Kristi Noem insisted on Fox News Sunday. "They have every right to protect their families from criminal retaliation." Law enforcement veterans echoed that sentiment, arguing that exposing officers' identities would lead to doxing ambushes and threats. But immigrant advocates weren't convinced. The Guardian Guardian reported multiple instances where masked individuals claiming to be ICE agents conducted unlawful detentions before disappearing, raising concerns that private militias or imposters could exploit the confusion. Illinois Representative Maria Santos summed it up bluntly: "If you can't see who's arresting you, how do you know it's even legal?" Political analysts saw deeper motives behind the standoff. Trump's allies viewed the backlash as a chance to nationalize ICE's authority and paint critics as anti-police radicals. Conservative media portrayed the No Secret Police Act as an attack on federal sovereignty. Meanwhile, progressive cities like Chicago and Los Angeles framed it as a battle for civil transparency in the age of federal overreach. The symbolism of masks carried political weight. For supporters, it represented bravery in the face of chaos. For opponents, it was a mark of authoritarianism, federal power stripped of accountability. We've entered a stage where secrecy itself becomes policy, warned Dr. Helena Rios, a political scientist interviewed by DW. When citizens can't see the face of authority, democracy begins to erode from within. Meanwhile, ICE's operational model was expanding. NBC News revealed that similar masked raids were being planned in Boston and Los Angeles, each city chosen precisely for its defiance of federal immigration orders. Analysts suggested that the administration's strategy wasn't simply enforcement, but a demonstration of dominance: cooperate or be crushed. Behind the headlines, another truth loomed. ICE was no longer just an enforcement agency, it had become the largest federal law enforcement body in American history, with over 45,000 active personnel and growing. A senior official told Reuters, "We are witnessing the evolution of ICE from a reactive agency to a proactive domestic force." And that's when legal experts began to sound the alarm. If anonymity, mass raids, and political targeting become normalized, what safeguards remain between a constitutional republic and a police state? By October 2025, the story that began with a raid in Chicago had reached the marble steps of the US Supreme Court, and the outcome would redefine civil rights for an entire generation. In a 5-4 decision, the court sided with the Trump administration, effectively legalizing racial profiling in immigration enforcement. The ruling overturned a Ninth Circuit decision that had barred ICE from using ethnicity or appearance as a factor in identifying suspects during operations in Los Angeles. Chief Justice Samuel Alito wrote in the majority opinion that national security interests permit broader discretion in field identification language that critics called a blank check for racial bias. Justice Sonia Sotomayor's dissent warned the decision would turn America into a nation where suspicion is skin deep. But by then, the machinery was already moving. ICE's National Command Center announced new directives expanding profiling authority nationwide. Within weeks, similar operations rolled out in Phoenix, Dallas, and Atlanta. Reuters reported that the number of people detained under expedited status verification procedures rose 270% in a single month, including U.S. citizens of Latino and Asian descent. One Chicago teacher, a naturalized citizen from Mexico, was detained twice in 5 days. "They told me to prove I belonged here," she told BBC News. Civil rights groups described it as institutional harassment under the color of law. Politically, the ruling was a windfall for the Trump White House. Administration officials framed it as the final green light for what they now openly call the National Deportation Strategy. At a rally honoring the late conservative activist Charlie Kirk, President Trump vowed, "We're going to save Chicago and every city like it from the crime, chaos, and corruption that the radical left has unleashed." His words drew roaring applause, but also deep unease among moderates and libertarians who warned of creeping authoritarianism. Behind the rhetoric, the scale of ICE's transformation was staggering. The agency's budget surpassed $15 billion, eclipsing the FBI and DEA combined. According to Defense News, DHS had begun integrating biometric data from Pentagon systems to enhance operational precision, effectively militarizing domestic surveillance. Meanwhile, military analysts warned that ICE's command structure was adopting a counterinsurgency framework treating immigrant neighborhoods as zones of instability. To many experts, this was the point of no return. The federal government has fused immigration control with national defense, said Dr. Peter Neumann, a security analyst cited by The Guardian. That's not law enforcement, that's occupation. Across the country, protests reignited, with cities like Seattle and Denver declaring they would no longer cooperate with any federal immigration requests. Yet in Washington, the tone was triumphalist. Trump praised ICE for taking America back, while state governors warned that civil unrest could soon force the administration to invoke martial authority if protests turned violent. The human toll, however, remained undeniable. Over 2,000 people had been deported from Illinois alone since Operation Midway Blitz began. Families fractured, businesses shuttered, and trust in law enforcement reached historic lows. Even conservative commentators began asking whether the cure had become worse than the disease. What began as a crackdown in Chicago had grown into a national doctrine, one where fear surveillance and show of force defined domestic policy. The question haunting every household now: when the next operation begins, who will be next on the list? Operation Midway Blitz was more than the largest ICE raid in Chicago's history. It became the blueprint for a new kind of federal power. What started as a targeted immigration sweep evolved into a sprawling national campaign marked by collateral arrests, secrecy, and deadly confrontations. The Franklin Park shooting revealed the lethal consequences of unchecked authority, while masked agents and the Supreme Court's 2025 ruling institutionalized fear as policy. Trump's administration celebrated these actions as restoring order. Critics saw them as steps toward authoritarianism. Economically, cities bled billions as undocumented workers vanished. Socially, communities fractured under constant threat. ICE grew into the most powerful law enforcement body in America, merging domestic policing with military strategy. As raids spread to new cities and public dissent mounts, one question remains: can the United States maintain its democratic ideals while pursuing security through overwhelming force? Or is the nation already crossing a line it may never return